The waterproof case was heavier than I expected. Cold, algae-filmed, one corner furred with lake sediment from however many decades it had been wedged beneath my grandfather's boathouse dock. I almost dropped it, hauling it up out of the shallows at Hawk Lake. Standing there in my work boots, shin-deep in water the color of dark tea, I had absolutely no idea that the object in my hands was about to dismantle 30 years of family mythology and reduce my brother's pristine, curated life to ash. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My grandfather, everyone called him Pop, was the kind of man who made rooms feel smaller just by walking into them. Not because he was loud or aggressive, the opposite. He had a stillness about him, the kind you only see in people who have genuinely seen the worst the world can produce and decided, quietly, to build something better. He came back from the Korean War in 1953 with nothing but a kit bag and a hardware trade apprenticeship certificate from the Department of Veterans Affairs. By 1971, he had turned a single hardware counter in Sudbury, Ontario, into a regional building supply operation serving contractors across the entire North. By 1990, McAllister Supply Group had warehouses in 6 cities and a fleet of 40 trucks. What he never had, what money apparently couldn't manufacture, was a family that matched him. My parents were the kind of people who wore their wealth like armor. My father ran the administrative side of McAllister Supply, and my mother ran every charity gala, garden party, and charity auction within a 40-kilometer radius of their home in the Bridle Path neighborhood of Toronto. They measured the world in net worth and neighborhood postcodes, and they applied that same measuring tape to their sons. My brother, Harrison, was 28 months older than me and approximately a geological era more impressive in their eyes. He had done everything correctly. Upper Canada College, then a commerce degree at Queen's, then an MBA, then a junior executive role at a Bay Street firm, before coming home to take a seat at the head of McAllister Supply's operations. He played golf with the right people, attended the right fundraisers, and had a talent for entering a room and immediately identifying whoever held the most power in it. My father called it leadership. Pop called it something else, once, in the quiet of his workshop, a word I didn't fully understand until much later. And then there was me. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is what I was. A custom furniture maker running a small workshop out of a rented industrial unit in Kitchener, perpetually behind on my BDC loan payments, driving a 2009 Ram with a cracked dashboard and one functioning taillight. I built things. Good things, actually. Dining tables from reclaimed barn wood, bookshelves jointed without a single screw, replacement parts for Victorian-era pieces that museums couldn't find anywhere else. None of it impressed my parents. None of it impressed my brother. Pop, on the other hand, used to drive the 90 minutes out from Toronto just to sit on an overturned milk crate in my workshop and watch me work. A man who makes a thing with his hands, he told me once, tapping the end of his walking stick on the concrete floor in a slow rhythm, always knows what it cost him. That's the only way you ever really own anything. I was 31 when he died. It was a Thursday in early March, one of those gray Ontario days where the sky looks like the underside of a sheet of old tin. His heart had been failing for 2 years, and in the end it simply stopped between one breath and the next, in his sleep, in the house he'd built on the shore of Hawk Lake in the Haliburton Highlands. He was 89 years old, and he died the same way he'd lived, without any particular fuss. The will reading took place 2 weeks later in the offices of a downtown Toronto firm. The room smelled of floor wax and cold coffee. My parents sat side by side on a leather sofa, my mother's hands folded in her lap like a woman waiting for a flight. My brother sat with one leg crossed over the other, already scanning emails on his phone, the kind of person who treats condolences as agenda items. I stood near the window, with my jacket still zipped, looking out at Bay Street, cutting through the sleet below. The estate lawyer cleared his throat and began. The liquid assets, a total of approximately $6.8 million CAD, distributed to my parents. I watched my father's posture ease slightly, like a man releasing a breath he'd been holding for months. McAllister Supply Group. The controlling 68% stake in the company, along with all associated real estate and rolling assets, transferred in full to my brother, effective immediately. My brother nodded once. No expression. He had been expecting it, we all had. Then my name. To my younger grandson, the estate lawyer read, "He leaves the deed to the property known as the Hawk Lake Cabin, located in the municipality of Dysart et al., Haliburton County, Ontario, along with $3,500 to cover immediate property taxes and applicable transfer fees." The room went completely quiet. My brother turned and looked at me the way you'd look at someone who'd shown up to a black tie event in coveralls. Then he laughed, one short, genuine laugh through his nose, like a pressure valve releasing. "The fishing camp," he said. "Pop left him the fishing camp?" My mother sighed. "Your grandfather was sentimental. That property has been sitting vacant for 15 years. I didn't say anything. I was doing the math in my head. The cabin. A 2-room structure on a Haliburton lake, with no municipal water hookup and hydro, that cut out every time a thunderstorm rolled through. The land might appraise at 30, maybe 40,000 on a generous day, the kind of place that sold for next to nothing, because the access road was 2 kilometers of unmarked gravel, and the dock had been rotting since before I was born. I was $63,000 in debt to the Business Development Bank. I had 4 months of runway on my workshop lease. I needed real money, not a collapsing fishing shack in cottage country. My brother stood and buttoned his jacket. On the way out, he stopped next to me and dropped a hand on my shoulder. "Hey, bright side, at least you can build yourself some new furniture up there. Put those skills to use." He said it the same way you'd tell someone. Their consolation prize was a lovely parting gift. Then he walked out. I picked up the envelope with the deed, walked to the elevator, and stood in it alone for the entire ride down to the parking garage. I told myself Pop had made a mistake. I told myself I'd misunderstood something. I spent 2 weeks convincing myself of that, while the BDC loan officer left messages I didn't return. Then I drove north. It's a 4-hour drive from Kitchener to the Hawk Lake turnoff, and for the last 40 minutes of it, you're on a 2-lane road threading through boreal forest, so dense you lose FM radio somewhere around Minden. The access road to the property was exactly as bad as I remembered. Rutted, narrowed by decades of unchecked spruce growth, the kind of track that makes your fillings ache. When I finally pulled into the overgrown clearing that served as a driveway, I sat in the truck for a full minute without getting out. The cabin was worse than I'd expected. The roof had developed a pronounced sag over the main room. The porch railing had collapsed entirely on one end. Lichen had worked its way under the cedar siding in thick patches, and one of the 2 front windows was cracked through the middle, stuffed with a twist of ancient newspaper to keep out the drafts. The dock, a 30-foot structure of boards and 4x4 posts extending into Hawk Lake, was tilted at a slight angle toward the water, half its planks missing or punched through by rot. I stood there in the dead March cold with my hands in my pockets and thought, I can sell this for $35,000 and put it toward the loan. It was the only plan I had. I started with the structural work, because that's what I know. I'd brought tools, a generator, a case of Quaker Oats, and a sleeping bag rated to -20. The first 2 days I reinforced the roof joists, replaced the worst of the porch boards, cleared a season's worth of mouse nests from the kitchen cupboards. The isolation was absolute. No cell service, no neighbors within earshot, just the sound of ice contracting on the lake after dark, and the occasional percussion of a dead branch dropping from a tree. On the 3rd day, I went to work on the fireplace. It was a fieldstone structure that dominated the main room, floor to ceiling, probably built when the cabin was first constructed sometime in the late 60s. The flue was choked with debris and bird nests, and I was using a length of flexible chimney rod to clear it when my hand bumped something that moved. Not a stone. Stones don't move. I shone my headlamp up into the flue cavity and saw it. A section of the back wall where 3 stones had been set loose, seated in their mortar without any adhesive bond. I pulled them free one at a time. Behind them was a cavity roughly the size of a shoebox, sealed with a length of expanding foam that someone had cut cleanly across the top. I pried it out. Inside the cavity was an oilskin pouch, the kind of thing you'd use to waterproof documents on a canoe trip. I brought it to the kitchen table and peeled it open. Inside was a composition notebook, the kind with the mottled black and white cover, and a folded piece of paper tucked into the back cover. The notebook was filled with Pop's handwriting, that same slanted, economical script I recognized from birthday cards and grocery lists he used to leave on the counter when I visited him as a kid. I sat down in the one chair that hadn't collapsed and started reading. The early entries were fishing logs, lake temperature, species caught, lure types, weather observations going back to 1994, completely ordinary. But somewhere around 2/3 of the way through, the entries changed. The dates jumped to roughly 8 years ago, and the tone went quiet in a different way. The way a person goes quiet when they're trying to write something down before the anger overtakes the words. March 3rd. Harrison pulled $40,000 out of the Tier 2 pension contributions again. Covered it by reclassifying it as an operating advance. Your father signed off on it without asking a single question. I checked the audit trail myself. They think I'm too old to understand spreadsheets. I understand exactly what I'm looking at. March 19th. Your father has restructured the corporate debt 3 times in 2 years to hide the interest load from the minority shareholders. The company looks solvent on paper. It is not solvent on paper. It is solvent because I am personally guaranteeing 7 figures of credit with assets that will revert to the company upon my death. They are counting on this. They have been counting on this for years. I turned the pages slowly, reading every entry twice. April 7th. I have made my decision. Paper money follows paper people. I have been converting. I didn't fully understand that last line. Converting what? I pulled out the folded note from the back cover. It was newer, the paper stiffer, the ink less faded. Pop's handwriting, but steadier, deliberate, like he'd written it carefully over a long sitting. Below the dock. 3rd post from shore, right side. Under the cross brace. You'll need to go in. I'm sorry about your boots. That was all. I sat with that note for a long time. Then I put on my waterproof work boots and walked down to the dock. The lake had shed most of its ice by then. The water near shore was dark and still, barely above freezing. I rolled my pants to my knees and waded in along the right side of the dock structure. The posts were thick, pressure-treated timbers going down into concrete footings, solid work, better than the dock surface above. I counted from shore, 1 post, 2, 3rd post, right side. I reached below the waterline, feeling along the cross brace running between the 2 nearest posts. My hand hit something that wasn't wood. A handle, nylon webbing, the kind on a dry bag. I gripped it and pulled. It took nearly a full minute of braced effort, my feet planted against the lake bottom, to free whatever it was from the suction of the mud and the weight of water above it. When it finally came loose, I staggered back 2 steps. The object was a military surplus waterproof transit case, heavy polymer with steel reinforcement along the edges, sealed with 2 compression latches. The kind of case you'd use to ship scientific equipment on a northern expedition. It was covered in silt and algae and weighed, I estimated, somewhere around 30 kilograms. I dragged it up the bank and onto the grass. Then someone knocked on the cabin door. The man standing on my porch was maybe 60, wearing outdoor technical clothing that still had the fold creases in it, the kind of gear people buy for cottage weekends and never actually use. He had a confident smile and the eyes of someone who does constant calculations. He introduced himself as a property consultant from a land acquisition firm based in Barrie. His clients, he said, were looking to consolidate lakefront holdings in the area. He was prepared to offer $160,000 CAD for the deed, cash, 30-day close. I said nothing for a moment. The assessed value of this property I had checked with the Dysart Municipal Office, was $41,000. I'm not looking to sell right now, I said. He smiled the way people smile when they've already decided the conversation is going their way. I can go to $195,000 if timing is a concern. I understand there's some financial pressure on your end. That sentence dropped into my chest like a stone into cold water. I had not mentioned my finances to anyone in connection with this property. The only people who knew about my BDC situation were my loan officer, my accountant, and my family. I'll think about it, I said, and closed the door. I stood with my back against the wood for about 20 seconds. Then I went back to the lakeshore, picked up the Trezette case, and brought it inside. The latches were stiff but not locked. I worked them open and lifted the lid. Inside, packed in dense foam cutouts, were rows of sealed polyethylene bags. Each bag contained coins, gold coins. I lifted one and turned it in the afternoon light coming through the cracked window. Royal Canadian Mint, the gold maple leaf. 1 troy ounce, 99.99% pure. I recognized them immediately. My grandfather had kept a single one on his desk for as long as I could remember, a paperweight he'd once called the only honest thing the government ever produced. There were dozens of bags. Beneath them, in a second layer of foam, were smaller pouches containing what I would later learn were rare pre-Confederation coins, 1858 50-cent pieces, 1870 silver dollars, pieces from the New Brunswick and Nova Scotia provincial series that predated Confederation, collector pieces worth multiples of their metal content. And beneath all of that, a sealed envelope with my name on it, handwritten, his handwriting. I stood in the kitchen of the collapsing cabin with my boots still wet and my hands shaking, and I read what my grandfather had written. He told me he'd been watching for years. He told me what he'd seen my brother doing with the pension contributions, what my father had done to cover it. He told me he'd spent the last 7 years quietly liquidating his personal equity, savings accounts and GICs, and a handful of investment positions my father hadn't known existed, and converting it to physical gold and collectible coins. Assets that couldn't be attached to a corporate estate. Assets that couldn't be frozen by a creditor or identified in a standard audit. He told me there was approximately $3.4 million CAD in that transit case at conservative spot prices. He told me the company my brother thought he'd inherited was built on a foundation of leveraged debt and falsified pension records, and that without Pop's personal guarantees backing McAllister Supply's credit facilities, the banks would call in their loans within months of his death. He told me my brother thought he had won. He told me he had let him think that. He ended with something I've never been fully able to read aloud without my voice doing something embarrassing. I watched you build things for 20 years. I never once saw you build anything that wasn't honest. That's rarer than any of this. Don't let them take it. I folded the letter and put it in my jacket pocket. That's when I heard the tires on the gravel outside. Not one vehicle, two. I moved the transit case behind the kitchen wood stove and pressed my back to the wall beside the window. Through the dirty glass, I watched a black Lexus SUV pull into the clearing, followed closely by a white pickup I didn't recognize. The Lexus had Ontario plates with the parking garage surround from McAllister Supply's Front Street head office. My brother got out of the Lexus. He was wearing a fleece quarter zip and the kind of technical trousers that cost $400 at an outfitter, what he considers casual. He stood in the clearing with his hands in his pockets and looked at the cabin the way you look at a property you've already decided to demolish. The man who got out of the pickup was built differently, wide across the shoulders, moving with the deliberate economy of someone doing this professionally. I didn't know him. He was the same man who'd knocked on my door that morning. They came inside without knocking. I came out of the kitchen. My brother stopped when he saw me. Something moved across his face, not surprise exactly, more like a timing recalculation. "Hey," he said, as though he'd just run into me at a Tim Hortons. "Good. I was hoping you'd already be here." "How did you know I was here?" I asked. "The consultant who came to your door this morning," he said. "He's not actually in real estate." He tilted his head slightly. "Did you find it?" I didn't answer. He took a slow look around the room. The open fireplace cavity, the oilskin pouch on the kitchen table, the wet boot prints tracking from the back door to the wood stove. He looked at the wood stove for a moment too long. "Whatever's in that case belongs to the company estate," he said, his voice shifting into the register he used in boardrooms. "Any assets Pop converted from McAllister Holdings are legally corporate property. I'll have a court order within 72 hours if you make this complicated." "He used personal post-tax funds," I said. "There's a complete paper trail, 7 years of purchase records." "A handwritten note and some coin receipts," my brother said. "That's not a legal instrument. I have a team on Bay Street who will tie that up in probate while your Kitchener lease lapses and the BDC comes for your tools." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, a brief appearance of the person underneath the performance. "Or I take what's there, I pay off your BDC loan personally, and you never have to deal with any of this property again. Clean break." The man from the pickup positioned himself between me and the back door. "Where is it?" my brother asked, quieter now. "Behind the stove," I said. He moved toward the kitchen. The other man followed. Both of them crowded into the small space around the wood stove. My brother crouched and pulled the transit case out from behind it. He set it on the kitchen table. The other man stood beside him, eyes on me. My brother opened the case. I have thought about the expression on his face in that moment many times since. The closest word I've found is recognition, the look of a man who has spent years believing in the abstract idea of a thing and is suddenly confronted with its physical, undeniable reality. He reached into the foam and lifted one of the polyethylene bags. The coins shifted inside with a dense, muffled weight. "Jesus," he said softly. He was completely absorbed, so was the man beside him. The kitchen in that cabin was 12 feet by 8. The door was behind me. The transit case was on the table between my brother and his associate, and leaning against the doorframe where I'd left it after bracing a sagging shelf joist, that morning was a 4-foot pry bar. I picked it up. They both registered the sound. But they were on the wrong side of a 12-foot kitchen with a 40-kilogram case between them and the exit, and I was already moving. I got through the door and hauled it shut behind me. It was a solid-core pine door on original hardware, the kind that latches firmly and swings true. I dropped the pry bar through the exterior door handle and the adjacent coat hook bracket in one motion, wedging it diagonally across the frame. Not a lock, but enough. The first impact hit the door 30 seconds later. I was already in the truck. The access road on a dry day is bad. On a March evening with overnight melt on the ground, it is actively terrifying. I drove the 2 kilometers out with both hands on the wheel and one thought in my head, the number of signal bars on my phone. The first bar appeared at the highway junction. By the time I'd pulled onto the tarmac and stopped on the shoulder, with the hazards blinking, I had enough signal to dial 911. I told the dispatcher I had intruders locked inside a structure on my property, that they had made threats, that I had reason to believe one of them was operating as a private investigator in connection with a commercial dispute over the estate. I gave the GPS coordinates I'd written down when I first arrived. I gave the deed reference number and my full name. The Ontario Provincial Police reached me at a gas station in Minden 25 minutes later. 3 cruisers. I handed over the deed, my identification, and the composition notebook. The senior officer read 3 pages without expression, then looked at me carefully. "You say there's a case of gold coins inside," she said. "Yes," I said. She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're deciding whether to believe something remarkable. Then she got in her cruiser, and I got in the passenger seat of the one behind it. When we got back to the cabin, the door was holding. The pry bar had seated itself more firmly with each impact, The bracket was bent but had not broken. The officer called out twice, identified herself, and had the bar removed. My brother came out first. He was disheveled in a way I had never seen him in 31 years, his fleece twisted, a smear of soot on one sleeve from where he'd apparently attempted the chimney cavity. He was already speaking before he'd fully cleared the door, his voice pitched toward calm authority, the boardroom register. The officer didn't interrupt him. She let him finish. Then she told him he was being detained for trespassing, breaking and entering, and uttering criminal threats, and that he had the right to retain and instruct counsel without delay. The look on his face at that moment is something I will carry for the rest of my life. What followed took 4 months to fully resolve. I used a portion of the gold. A single bag of maple leaf sold through a licensed dealer in Toronto to retain one of the better Bay Street litigation firms. They took the case with what I can only describe as genuine corporate enthusiasm. Pop had documented everything. 7 years of purchase receipts, private bank records from accounts my parents hadn't known existed, a complete chain of custody. Because every asset had been purchased with post-tax personal funds and recorded meticulously, my brother's argument that the gold represented company assets my grandfather had improperly diverted collapsed in the first round of filings. The coins were mine, legally, undeniably, without condition. But it was the notebook that did the real damage. My lawyers delivered a copy to the Ontario Securities Commission and the RCMP's Commercial Crime Section 2 weeks into the proceedings. The investigation was not swift, but it was thorough. The pension contribution records at McAllister Supply were audited back 7 years. What they found matched Pop's notes exactly. $340,000 in diverted Tier 2 contributions, reclassified and buried across 4 fiscal years. The personal guarantee structures my father had signed were fully unraveled. The leveraged debt load, concealed from minority shareholders through a series of quiet restructurings, came into the open all at once. The banks did not wait. Within 10 weeks of the audit becoming public, McAllister Supply Group's primary credit facilities were frozen. Without Pop's personal guarantees, which had died with him, there was nothing holding the credit structure together. The company filed for creditor protection in September. By December, it was in full liquidation. My brother was charged the following spring. Fraud over $5,000, breach of trust, and multiple violations of the Federal Pension Benefit Standards Act. I watched the press conference announcing the charges on my laptop in my workshop in Kitchener, still surrounded by the smell of sawdust and linseed oil, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, exactly. Something quieter, like a sound you've been hearing so long you stop noticing it, and then suddenly it stops. My parents lost almost everything. Their own finances had been tied to my brother's corporate structure in ways they either hadn't understood or hadn't wanted to examine. Personal real estate pledged against corporate lines of credit, retirement savings moved into fund structures that auditors subsequently froze. The house in the bridle path went into a forced sale in the spring. My father called me once. It was a Sunday morning in April, early enough that I'd been asleep. "We made errors," he said. "Not mistakes, errors." He still couldn't quite reach a simpler word. I listened to him for 2 minutes. I thought about 31 years. I thought about every family dinner where my job was the punchline, every holiday where my mother asked when I was going to do something real, every time my brother had introduced me to his colleagues with that almost imperceptible pause before the word furniture. I thought about Pop sitting on an overturned milk crate in my workshop, watching me plane a board, not saying anything at all, just watching, the way you watch something you find genuinely good. "I'm sorry, Dad," I said. "I hope you figure it out." I put the phone down. 18 months later, I stood on the dock at Hawk Lake in early September, holding a mug of coffee and watching the light move across the water. The cabin behind me was unrecognizable from what I'd inherited. I hadn't flipped it or turned it into something it wasn't meant to be. I'd spent 11 months restoring and expanding it the right way. New roof framing in white pine, the fieldstone fireplace repointed and cleaned to bare stone, a second-story sleeping loft added in the same cedar as the original siding. Its south wall opened up with a bank of windows I'd built and glazed myself. The dock was rebuilt from new pressure-treated timber, properly engineered, solid enough to last another 40 years. Below the dock, in the third post from shore on the right side, I'd had a proper watertight vault installed in the concrete footing. The transit case was in there. Most of it, anyway. I'd used enough to clear my debts, establish a trust, and start properly. The rest I intended to leave exactly where Pop had put it, converted into its simplest and most honest form, accumulating nothing and requiring nothing, the way he'd taught me things of genuine value always do. I had reopened my shop in a converted rail freight building in Cambridge, with good north light and room for 4 workbenches. I'd hired 2 former apprentices and an operations manager. We built furniture, good furniture, the kind that takes time and doesn't apologize for it. I named the company McAllister Craftworks because my grandfather had built something honest once, and I decided that name still deserved to mean something. Pop was right about all of it. My brother had wanted the empire, the title, the stock options, the name printed in bold at the top of a press release. He got exactly what that kind of empire is worth when the foundation finally gives way. I got the lake, I got the dock, I got a case full of something that holds its weight through any kind of weather, and a name that meant what I needed it to mean. I got everything he actually had to give. And standing there in the September light, with the water perfectly still and the birches just starting to turn along the far shore, I never once doubted it was enough.